Okay, I'm back, and thanks for joining me for the second chapter of this video story. In chapter one, what I argued is that all of this, everything that is happening in the world right now, should lead us to 5 words. We are missing something big. And if you, like me, are led to those 5 words, then there are just 2 questions that become obvious and urgent. And the first question obviously is, so what are we missing? And the second question is, where do we find it? So right now I want to tackle the first of those questions. And I think the good news is that the answer to this first question really isn't hard at all. And it should be obvious to us and made even more obvious by everything that is happening in the world right now, which is that this big thing that we are missing is each other. We're missing each other. And not just in a love your neighbor sense, although that's part of it. It was Albert Einstein who I think said it best. He said that humans are part of a whole, but we experience ourselves as separated from the rest. And that experience of separation is a delusion of our consciousness. And so our work as full persons is to widen our circle of concern and compassion so that we break out of that prison of our own delusions. Einstein was right, and we still have so much work to do. We are still largely missing from one another's circle of concern. But what has happened and what is so dangerous is that it doesn't just stop there. In far more concrete and immediate ways, we are now also missing one another. Just step back and think of the gaps in income, in wealth, in health, in education, in opportunity that we live in now as one society. At the basic level of where we live, where we work, where we play, where we study, we are increasingly isolated from one another. Just think about social media and how it has led to us missing one another more than ever before. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but there was this experience in the past of this mass shared experience of being an audience to a broadcast. And that's gone now, right? Replaced with the mass personalization of our own newsfeed. So we are missing one another from that experience of understanding what is going on in the world. Public spaces where we might encounter one another as whole persons, those are disappearing too. Right? It's very hard to find a public space that, at least in some respect, isn't also branded, isn't also trying to make us into consumers, isn't trying to divide us by ability to spend and pay for the level of service or product that we can consume. And maybe most fundamentally at all, just at the level of truth and our proofs for our truths. These things have become personal things, less shared things that connect us to one another, and more personal things that connect us deeper into ourselves and to our own defined groups. And so it's not just a moral thing anymore. At the very center of our being and thinking and acting, we are omitting one another from our lives, from our awareness and understanding and perspective on the world. And it is such a dangerous thing. And we're living in a moment that reveals to us just how dangerous that is, because it is creating this bizarre gap between an increasingly complex world and an increasingly simple way that we have of seeing it and making sense of it. And this leads me to the second simple picture that to me explains so much of the moment we live in and how to navigate it. In chapter 1, I showed the first simple picture of human flourishing over time. And in that picture explained that, we could be on this graph, and why aren't we? Why are we on this lower graph? And there's a second simple picture that actually looks a lot like the first, but I want to introduce it here in chapter 2. And this picture is complexity over time. So complexity and time. Now we live in a moment where the complexity of our problems is increasing, is becoming greater and greater. Why is it that the complexity of our solutions is becoming simpler and simpler? And in fact, sometimes it feels like the complexity of our solutions is actually approaching zero, right? Technology is the only solution we need. It's going to solve all of our problems. And this graph is, so simple and yet so troubling. And I see it everywhere. Before this pandemic event, where I saw this graph was in the aftermath of the 2020 World Economic Forum, where the great and powerful get together. The main topic was climate change, and the big solution that came out of that gathering was an initiative, a global initiative, a big, bold plan to plant 1 trillion trees. And I thought, seriously? I mean, do you not see that this kind of silver bullet solution thinking is exactly the level of thinking that has gotten us into the situation where we didn't want to be in the first place? Right? That is leaders riding this curve. Right? The only way they know how, rather than learning to ride a curve that they don't understand. That is top-down, technocratic, industrial scale, mopping up a spill instead of this very difficult process of trying to figure out the cultural and the social and the economic and all the systemic dimensions of making it so that we don't spill in the first place. Right? We're never going to solve climate change or mental health or income inequality or pandemic risk or the next shock that none of us are going to see coming by riding this curve. We're only going to solve it on this curve at a level of thinking that is equal to the problems that we face. And so how do we get from this curve to this curve? The only answer is together, by making concrete for one another the complexities of our problems. So that if we can navigate one another, then we can navigate that problem. It's funny. We're also attracted to this idea of maybe thinking differently. We'd all love to think differently, to see the world differently than other people do. We can imagine the power and the opportunity of that. But the ironic thing is that we're all trying to think differently in the same way. And that's as individuals. Right? We're all individually riding this curve down together, adopting a smaller and smaller set of best practices and mental models in order to think differently than other people do. But if we really want to think differently, then we've got to learn how to think together. Because we're all tuned into our own wavelength. Right? We're all hearing our own signal. And if that's all that we hear, then we're never going to get the full message that the world is trying to share with us. So, to summarize, chapter 1, we are missing something big. And the evidence of that is all around us. And that means that there are 2 urgent and important questions that we can all be asking ourselves, both to help solve these problems, but also to start unlocking the full possibilities of the time we live in. Question 1, so what is this thing that we are missing? And question 2, where do we find it? And the answer to the first question is simple. We are missing each other. And not just in a moral sense, but in our most basic sense-making of the world. Now, all we need to do is find each other. And the question that's left is where.